These are serious charges. They can carry, in China's legal system, a penalty of years in jail or even the death sentence here. And we see, yes, while Australia's been accused of being, well, a little too quiet in handling this issue so far, today, with this news, Foreign Minister Marise Payne referring to his harsh treatment, raising concerns that he has essentially been held as a political prisoner, demanding very openly that China produce some evidence, some explanation as to what he's said to have done wrong. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by James Lawrenson. He's the Acting Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at UTS. Thanks very much for your time. Perhaps I should start by saying, do you know Yang Hengjun? Have you worked with him at all? And what can you tell us about this man?
No, I haven't worked with him personally, David, but look, the facts are very clear in this case, and the Foreign Minister Payne reiterated them. I mean, he's been held for 7 months in China without access to lawyers, without access to his family. The charges remain vague. And today we know that it sounds to me pretty clear that Marise Payne has concerns about his treatment, specifically referring to his treatment as being harsh. So, look, I'm as concerned as anyone about this, and I'm glad the Foreign Minister is taking a strong stand.
What do you know of the Chinese legal system and how this process works? He was detained back in January, passing through Guangzhou Airport, was then held in some sort of residential detainment for 6 months or so before being put into criminal detention, and now this announcement of the arrest today. So where is that at?
Yeah, look, it's still messy, David. As I understand it, the next steps may take days, months, or possibly even years, his own lawyers are saying, in China. And of course, the big concern for all Australians is that the Chinese legal system is not separate from the Chinese Communist Party. It sits under the Chinese Communist Party. So you've got to have real questions about whether he's going to get a fair treatment, even once this does progress.
Yeah, well, that's the point here, isn't it? There is no transparency around the Chinese legal system, and the conviction rate is 99.9%.
Yeah, that's right, David. So this is why it's so distressing for everyone. And look, the Australian government has done the right thing in this case. I think originally, you know, they tried to get a successful outcome by keeping it out of the headlines, and I don't hold that against them. But as things have progressed, they've ramped up their statements. A few months ago, Marise Payne said she was deeply disappointed, and today she's come out with a lengthy statement. And look, I think that escalation is entirely appropriate.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this because there's a school of thought that it's best to handle these things quietly, behind the scenes, softly. Once you get the megaphone out, it makes life a lot harder for the person detained. But what has been the experience with China? This is not the first foreign national to find themselves caught in the Chinese legal system. Is it best to go quietly, or is it best to go public?
Yeah, look, there's no science here. There's no science here. It really does come down to the Australian government's and the other foreign governments' evaluations in each case. I mean, I think of the Canadian situation where you had some Canadian citizens detained in pretty clearly, it appears to be hostage diplomacy to me, and the Canadian government called for their, publicly, loudly called for their immediate release. They haven't been released. So, you know, everyone's really just trying to do the best they can and get the best outcomes for their citizens, but it's not black and white, it's not simple.
Yeah, the hostage diplomacy line you used there is an interesting one. That was in relation to Huawei. Do you think this one, Yang Hengjun, bears hallmarks of some sort of diplomatic tit-for-tat?
I don't think so, David. So this is serious, don't get me wrong. In every sense this is serious. But in the Canadian case, we actually had a Chinese national detained, and a couple of days later we had Canadian citizens detained. So it was pretty clear tit for tat. Now, look, I know the Australian government has made some decisions that China doesn't like over the last couple of years, such as banning Huawei from our 5G rollout, but that was last August. So I just wouldn't leap to attributing this particular case to hostage diplomacy.
Well, indeed, it seems more likely to be a result of what he's been writing himself, his blogs, his novels and so on. Give us a sense of where he's been going with his writing over the years.
Well, look, as I understand it, he's actually toned down his writing in recent years. So, you know, as someone sitting here without detailed insider knowledge of the case, it's hard for me to say, but it certainly does seem extraordinary that the Chinese government would see fit to detain this Australian citizen, particularly when they still refuse to give clarity over the specific charges that they say he's guilty of.
Where do you see this going in terms of the relationship between Australia and China? The Foreign Minister today, as you note, put out a lengthy and fairly strong statement. Presumably the Prime Minister will be asked about this at some point as well. How much is this going to, well, further damage the relationship?
Well, look, it's certainly not going to help. And naturally, the Australian government is going to quite rightly factor this into their own engagement with China and how they treat the bilateral relationship. At the same time, we're not well served. The national interest isn't well served by conflating everything together and seeing all the relationship with China through the eyes of the differences and the disputes in the relationship. Scott Morrison's made that pretty clear. Don't forget that a lot of the engagement between Australia and China is between Chinese households and Australian households, Chinese companies and Australian companies. It's not about the Chinese Communist Party. So I think it is important that we keep some clarity in our thinking as well, at the same time as we acknowledge these very serious developments.
In other words, don't start making threats on the trade front or any other front simply to apply pressure over Yang Hengjun.
Yeah, look, I think that's correct, Dave, and I don't think there's any evidence that, for example, threatening to, cut off iron ore supplies to China is going to get a positive outcome for Yang Hengjun. I think the Foreign Minister has done a very good job in this case, and I think we're all behind her in her escalation of the matter.